Hello, and welcome to the Dance Physio Podcast, a podcast designed to explore ideas and foster discussion around dancer health and wellness. We're here to challenge the status quo, bridge the gap between dance science and the studio, and help change the landscape of the dance industry for the better. I'm your host, Erika Mayall, a dancer turned physiotherapist who is deeply passionate about leaving the dance world better than I found it. I'm so glad you're here. Let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Dance Physio Podcast. I am your host, Erika Mayall. This week, we are continuing on with the theme of scoliosis. So if you listened to last week's episode, I had Andrea Mendoza on from the ScoliClinic, and we talked about all things scoliosis and especially idiopathic scoliosis. If you have not yet listened to that episode, I really suggest going back and listening to last week's episode before you listen to this week's episode. This is just a little bit of an add-on to what Andrea and I talked about, but I think it's really important for people to understand a lot of the foundational concepts of what we discussed last week. She gave us so much information about what scoliosis is and how it occurs and why it occurs and what we know about the pathophysiology of it and why we see it commonly in dancers and all sorts of things. We got into all sorts of great information. Today, what I want to dive into just a tiny bit more is how it affects dancers kind of in the studio. So we did touch on that just a little bit last time, and especially teachers' roles in recognizing and potentially flagging for scoliosis and things like that. But I just want to talk a little bit about dancers' experiences of scoliosis or how it might affect them in the studio or how they present and how teachers can kind of help with dancers who may have a scoliosis, and just dive into that a little bit more because we just didn't have a chance last week to get into some of that nitty gritty. So, like I said, if you have not listened to last week's episode yet, hit pause, go back, listen to that one, and then come back and pick up this episode because they really are meant to be kind of a part one and part two. So, the first thing I want to say, and I really don't know if we sort of like hit home about this last week and we kind of touched on it really briefly, but the first thing I want to say is there are many dancers who have a scoliosis who have very successful professional dance careers. And I think sometimes, especially for families, but for dancers too, a lot of the dancers getting diagnosed with a scoliosis are within that age range of the adolescent growth spurt. So they might be 11, 12, 13, somewhere in that age range. And getting a diagnosis of scoliosis can be really scary and produce a lot of anxiety and uncertainty in how this, like, will this affect my dancing? Will I be able to continue dancing? All of those questions. So I just really want to reiterate that although you might have to adapt certain things in your dancing, and we'll get into that in a second, it is by no means going to prevent you from continuing on in the dance world and having a successful dance career. There are lots of examples of not even just professional dancers, but professional athletes. I think probably the most famous or the one people are maybe most aware of is Usain Bolt, who, was, I don't think is anymore, but was for a long time the fastest man in the world. And he has quite a significant scoliosis. And so if you ever see, there's like training photos or training videos of him where he's wearing like a really tight singlet or even I think without a top on, and you can see just how pronounced that scoliosis is. And obviously, that is not affecting his performance. And there are plenty of examples within the dance world as well. If you are looking for inspiration, I suggest just go Google it. There's lots of well-documented cases of professional dancers in lots of different genres, but even ballet, because I think ballet is the one that people are most concerned about because of this kind of like desired aesthetic for symmetry in ballet a lot of times, but there are plenty of examples of professional ballet dancers as well who have had very successful careers. So I just want to drive that point home because, again, a diagnosis or talking about scoliosis can be really scary, but it doesn't need to be. It's almost one of those things that like information is power. And if we know that a dancer is dealing with this, then we can adapt our training and really make sure that we're making things individual to that dancer to make sure that they have longevity in their career. It doesn't need to hold them back from dancing. The next thing I want to talk about just briefly, because again, we didn't really dive into it a ton last week, is the difference between what we call a structural scoliosis and what is deemed a functional scoliosis. And so we were specifically talking about structural scoliosis last time. And so we were talking about when there is this idiopathic process that happens where we actually have a change in how the vertebrae are growing and developing and the shape of those vertebrae that is causing the kind of curvature and the rotational components of this scoliosis. That is the structural type. That is mostly what we're talking about when we're talking about adolescent idiopathic scoliosis. There is also something that we deem functional scoliosis. And so in a functional scoliosis, we may see a curve in the spine, and most commonly we see like a side bending curve. I see it most commonly in the lumbar spine. I don't see it as much in the thoracic. That's not to say that it doesn't happen, but just in a dance population, I see it more as a lumbar curvature, but there is not the associated rotation with it a lot of the time. And there's generally not the associated change in the structure of the vertebrae. There's something that's pulling the spine into a bit of like a curvature, a curved pattern, but we're not seeing those same structural changes in a sort of more quote unquote functional scoliosis. One of the hallmarks of a functional scoliosis is that the curve changes depending on what position we might be in versus a structural scoliosis that we can have somebody standing up, lying down, hanging upside down, hanging from an aerial apparatus. Like, it doesn't matter what they're doing, that curve is still going to be present. But oftentimes with a functional scoliosis, it's being driven by an external force. And so the external force could be muscle imbalances. I'll talk more about that in a second. It could be a leg length difference. It could be all sorts of different things. But if we change that person's position, there's going to be an impact on that functional scoliosis. So maybe in standing, so if we use the example of, say, a leg length difference, in standing, we might see a bit of a functional scoliosis in the lumbar spine where there's a bit of a side bending or a curve. But if that person lies down or that person is hanging upside down, we might see that curve disappear. The most common functional scoliosis that I see in dance, like I said, is in the lumbar spine, and it is more often than not due to asymmetries in training. We will very, very, very commonly see dancers who develop increased musculature on one side of their low back specifically, and that in turn can create this kind of pull that causes this curve or this side bending to happen. I see this most commonly in dancers who are doing solos and have a lot of kind of extension-y type move. So whether that's like leg holds or just kicks or tilts or whatever it happens to be, maybe it's arabesques, maybe it's penchés, doesn't really matter. But a lot of moves where they have one leg that is commonly their supporting leg and the other leg that is their gesture leg. And generally for a solo, we're always going to choreograph to a dancer's strength. So depending on what leg is their sort of quote unquote stronger supporting leg, that one tends to be the supporting leg over and over and over again in choreography. Then we have these dancers who are maybe doing 2, 3, 4 solos, and they're rehearsing those over and over and over and over again. And so we develop this imbalance in the musculature, which can cause this kind of functional scoliosis to appear. We see it in dancers who aren't doing solos too, because group choreography, again, tends to sort of default to what the sort of majority of people maybe have as their favored supporting leg. So we often see dancers standing on their left leg and turning to the right, or standing on their left leg and kicking their right leg. So we can see it show up in group choreography as well, but I will say I don't see it as commonly, probably because I think there's a little bit more balance right side to left side in group choreography, and then also maybe not the same repetition of individual skills that are being done over and over and over again, like we see in dancers who are performing and rehearsing solos. So all of that to say, you don't need to not do solos. You can absolutely continue to do solos. And I'm not suggesting that choreographers all of a sudden start choreographing on your less strong side to balance things out. But we just need to be really aware that if you are rehearsing and having solo practices and privates and stuff where you know that you're doing a lot of repetitive stuff on one side, then maybe outside of those times when you're doing your own conditioning programs, or if we're looking at like strength training or gym sessions or things like that, we may need to be looking at evening out those kind of imbalances so that we're building strength on the opposite side. And so we're not creating these kind of functional scoliosis or these curvatures or imbalances that are happening. So I just wanted to touch on that because, like I said, I see these ones really commonly, probably even more commonly than the dancers who have this like structural scoliosis. I see it so commonly, and I think a lot of parents especially can get a bit alarmed about like, oh my goodness, like they have a scoliosis. Do we need to go and get this, assessed and blah, 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 blah. And sometimes yes, but a lot of times it is functional in that when we change the position of the dancer and we change how they're moving or how they're oriented, that curve disappears and we can see that it is very much related to a muscle imbalance. As far as our dancers who do have this structural scoliosis, I just want to touch on things that we will commonly see in the studio that dancers might experience potentially even before they know they have a scoliosis. Or teachers, you might be picking up on this in the studio before you really notice that there's a curve in the spine. But one of the most common things that we see is an unevenness through port de bras. So this could be with the arms in any position, but oftentimes you'll find that like if the dancer has their arms at their side, so say their arms are in like bras, you notice that like one hand looks a little bit lower or higher than the other, or their shoulder girdle looks, one side's a bit dropped, one side's a bit raised in through there, like just this asymmetry or unevenness through the shoulder girdle and through the arms, especially like fifth position is one as well, where people will really commonly see this. And teachers are often, and especially in a dancer like pre-diagnosis, teachers are often correcting that. And they'll say, drop your right shoulder or drop your left, whichever side it is, drop your shoulder to try and even things out. And the dancer is thinking in their head like, I am trying to drop my shoulder. I'm dropping it as much as I physically can, and it still looks uneven in through there. But the teacher's always seeing this asymmetry or this unevenness and constantly trying to have the dancer correct their shoulder placement or correct their arm placement, or whether it's like an arabesque and trying to like fix the front arm and back arm or whatever it is. So that's one thing that really commonly we'll see. And oftentimes, because of, like Andrea kind of talked about, there's that rotational component, and the rotational component will really affect where the rib cage is sitting. Because the shoulder blades sit on top of the rib cage, that shoulder girdle asymmetry or arm or port de bras asymmetry can sometimes be more noticeable than asymmetries further down the spine, like things that are affecting more of like the lumbar spine or the pelvis, which we'll talk about in a second. So sometimes that shoulder girdle or port de bras asymmetry is very noticeable, and the first thing that teachers will notice in terms of when dancers are trying to keep their arms. And for me, I think I shared last time that I do have a mild scoliosis that was picked up by a dance teacher, and that was definitely, I remember getting corrections about my shoulder placement. And for me, it was actually when my arms were in second a lot of the time. And she would always say, one of your arms is higher than the other in second. Like my arms were sort of crooked when I was in second position, and I couldn't feel it unless I was like looking in the mirror and then I could see it. But that was one of the first kind of clues that maybe there was a bit of asymmetry happening in my spine, was actually my arm and shoulder girdle position in through there. So that's very, very common, what we'll see in terms of presentation. Then if we kind of continue on down the spine and sort of think a little bit lower, one of the next things that we'll sort of commonly see with dancers is their sort of hips or their pelvis being shifted to one side. And again, if they have a curve that affects the lumbar spine, then that's going to affect the position of the pelvis. So the pelvis is going to be shifted one direction or the other. And you can see this commonly if a dancer is just standing with their arms at the side. Often what you'll see is the arm touches one hip and then there'll be like a gap or a space between the arm and the other hip, like as their arms are hanging down, or you can kind of see just like that little asymmetry in through there. But how this often presents with dancers with that kind of hip shifted to the side is that it often looks like they have more weight going through one leg versus the other. They often do have more weight going through one leg versus the other. So if they are, say, doing a plie or doing a squat or something like that, you'll see that they just don't look 100% balanced between their two legs. And they may be, in their body feeling balanced, but because of that hip being shifted to the side, it's looking like they're favoring one leg or have more weight going through one leg. You'll often also see these dancers having difficulty getting sort of quote unquote on top of their leg. So one side, if they transfer their weight, say they're in a retire or they're doing a turn like a pirouette or something, they're solid and they feel like they can get on top of their leg. And to the other side, they kind of always feel like they're falling off of that leg a little bit. It's really hard for them to find their center and find their balance on that side without, again, like sort of compensating. Again, a correction that teachers might be giving those dancers, because teachers are often going to pick up on that on one side, they're like, oh, it doesn't look like you're on top of your leg, or your hip looks like it's sticking out to the side. Sometimes teachers are going to try and give corrections to be like, push your hip back in or shift your weight to the other direction or things like that to try and help that dancer get on top. But if that is a structural change in their spine, they're not going to be able to do that. They're not going to be able to simply like shove their hip back the opposite direction because it is structurally sitting more to one side than the other, or their pelvis, I should say, not so much their hip. So again, if teachers are noticing something in a dancer and you're trying to give a correction and they just don't seem to be able to apply it, that might be a little bit of like a red flag to be like, okay, is there something going on that is structurally making this happen, making that shift happen, making their pelvis be more to one side than the other, or even rotated a lot of the times we'll see as well. And so that could be the thing that's preventing that dancer from being able to apply those corrections if you're giving them the same corrections over and over and they just don't seem to be able to physically apply it in their body. Keeping on the theme of the pelvis, like I just mentioned, we often see like a rotation that happens within the pelvis as well. So when I was talking about that shift before, I'm talking more like a lateral shift, so like from side to side. But we will often see a rotation in the pelvis as well. So it'll look like one half of the pelvis is like coming forwards or more anteriorly rotated, and the other half of the pelvis is, kind of more posteriorly rotated or shifting backwards a little bit in through there. And if we have those rotations happening in the pelvis as well, because remember, we talked about in the spine, we're not just talking about side bending curvature, there's rotation that's happening in that spine. That same rotation can happen down into the pelvis. If we have that rotation happening in the pelvis, that is going to affect the orientation of the hip sockets in those dancers. So one hip socket on the side of the pelvis being rotated further forward, that hip socket is also going to travel further forward because it is attached to the side of the pelvis, like the acetabulum. The other side is going to be shifted relatively posteriorly. And so when we think about turnout and turnout range, we will very commonly see an asymmetry in turnout range in these dancers, where one hip seems to be much, much more easily able to turn out into external rotation, and the other hip is going to be more limited in that external rotation. And again, trying to have a dancer sort of achieve quote unquote equal turnout on both sides might not be anatomically possible for this dancer if there is this rotation happening, or they like truly sort of have different amounts of turnout available. Now, I understand that aesthetics are still desired. I was going to say required, but I'm going to say desired, because this is very much a like culturally we have decided that dance should be symmetrical from an aesthetic point of view. So it is not unreasonable to ask a dancer to try and achieve, especially in, say, like a first position or a second position where maybe it's really obvious if one leg is much more turned out than the other. We may ask a dancer to try and make their turnout slightly more symmetrical. But if we are going to do that, it is really important that we are not trying to force the side that has less turnout into a more turned out position. And that is what almost all dancers will try and do. If you point out the asymmetry, they'll say, oh, well, that one side can go that far, so therefore I'm going to like push the opposite side to that same degree of turnout. What we need to do is the side that turns out a bit more, we may need to bring that in a little bit to match the side that's slightly more restricted. So if we are truly desiring symmetry, like visual symmetry, because it's not anatomically going to be symmetrical, but if we are desiring visual symmetry, we need to bring the opposite side in rather than trying to force the limited side into more turnout, because we just know that that's going to create a spiral of all sorts of negative consequences if that is what we're trying to do. In a lot of positions in dance, we're not going to be able to tell. If we have a dancer who's in, say, fifth position, because one leg is in front and one leg's in the back, and then you're switching sides, you can't often tell this difference in turnout symmetry when a dancer is in a lot of positions or when they're dynamically moving. You are never going to notice this. I promise you, if you watch a dancer on stage who has a difference in turnout from side to side, you're never going to pick it up as someone in the audience as a dancer is dynamically moving. It is only when dancers are in really static positions, which is not all that often, and especially in, say, first position or second position or something. However, I know that there are times where that might be required, and so we may have to accommodate for that. And one of the things that's popping into my head is some programs still require still photographs of dancers as part of like an audition process. I have all sorts of thoughts on that I will not get into right now. But if they are, asking the dancer to demonstrate whatever the still position is, and it is often, standing in second position with the arms in second position or something like absurd like that, you may bring one side in a little bit just to create a little bit more of a symmetrical kind of aesthetic in through there. But apart from that, mostly nobody is going to notice. But a dancer is going to feel it in their body. So understanding that it is there and why it is there is really important, but it's not necessarily going to impact their ability to dance well. Another thing that is going to be affected, by everything in the spine in terms of like those changes, the side bending and rotation components, but especially the pelvic kind of rotation as well, is arabesque type positions. So oftentimes we will have a dancer who has one side where their arabesque just feels like so natural. If it's following the direction that the curve in their spine goes, because in an arabesque, we have a degree of rotation that is happening, a degree of kind of quote unquote curvature that is happening because of these like opposing lines in the spine. If they're on the side that, sort of goes in the direction that their curve goes, it's going to feel so comfortable and so natural to them. Like they're just going to feel like this feels almost like home, some dancers will say. But on the opposite side of that, when we try and come into an arabesque on the other side, it will often feel very, very foreign, maybe. It feels, maybe restricted or like a lot of effort to try and get themselves into the correct alignment. And again, this is just something that we need to be aware of and maybe accept that they're going to have a side that is much easier and is maybe going to feel much more effortless, and a side that is going to maybe not look quite as polished or quite as effortless. But that is structurally the way they are built. And so we don't want to, again, be trying to force these dancers into trying to make things exactly symmetrical, because they're not anatomically going to be able to do that. Another thing that we commonly will see in dancers is unevenness in flexibility. And so sometimes maybe that's affecting their arabesque or something like that. But even things like splits, like dancers will say, oh, I'm like down on one side and I've been down for ages and it's really easy for me to get into the splits. And on the other side, I'm miles off of it. I've been working on it for ages and I'm just not making a lot of progress. And so again, with those rotations in the pelvis and everything that travels up the chain, this can affect mobility from side to side. And so it is not uncommon for dancers to notice a big sort of discrepancy or unevenness between their flexibility from side to side. That's not to say that every dancer who has a difference in flexibility side to side has a scoliosis, because most dancers have a difference in flexibility from side to side, but it may be more pronounced in these dancers who have an asymmetry in their sort of structure and in their foundation. Oftentimes going along with this unevenness, asymmetry, whatever you want to call it, in flexibility is we will see more nerve tension in general in dancers who have a scoliosis, but we will also see sort of uneven nerve tension patterns. So if we do a nerve tension test on one side, it might be, mildly positive, or maybe it's not even positive at all. And on the other side, it might be really, really positive. So I will often see a big difference in nerve tension from side to side in dancers who have a scoliosis. Like I said, just in general, overall, I would say I see higher degrees of nerve tension in dancers who have a scoliosis. And this makes perfect sense, because scoliosis is a change in the spine and in the spine alignment, and running through the center of our spine is our spinal cord. So it is part of our central nervous system. It is directly connected to our nervous system. All of the nerves that come off of the spinal cord into our peripheries are going to be impacted by that curvature in the spine. So there's going to be more tension on certain nerves and less tension on others. But overall, there is generally more tension through the nervous system from what I've seen in my dancers. So it's something that if I'm working with dancers who have a scoliosis, we are often working on or giving them tools to be able to address nerve tension within their body. So these are just some of the hallmark things that I see in dancers who have a scoliosis, and specifically a structural scoliosis. In terms of working with these dancers, so specifically for teachers, first of all, if you're noticing these little things and you're sort of giving dancers corrections about these, and you're like, that's not sticking, and their arms still look crooked, and like there's something going on with their port de bras or whatever it is, again, this might be a red flag to have them go get assessed or screened for a scoliosis. Or if you know that your dancers have a scoliosis, I would encourage you to refrain from making a lot of those corrections that have to do with how they are structurally aligned. And so again, constantly correcting a dancer to put their shoulder down when they anatomically cannot do it. Like that is how they're built. We just actually need to learn to accommodate them and how they are actually building. Now, that's not to say that like artistically you're not still going to correct those types of things, but if your only correction is constantly put your shoulder down, put your shoulder down, put your shoulder down, that isn't giving us any sort of like artistic quality or an artistic correction that dancer can actually apply. They cannot physically put that shoulder down. Again, that's just one example. But if you're finding yourself always giving these corrections that have to do with their anatomy and this kind of asymmetry that they have, that is not helpful. And that can be really frustrating for the dancers because they are like, I can't do anything about it. Or if they are trying to, so in an example, let's say if they're trying to correct like their rib shift to one side or their hip shift to one side, and they just try and shove it in the opposite direction, that actually doesn't help them. That kind of potentially throws things off even more because the body has developed all of these compensation strategies. So if the rib cage is shifted one way, the hips are generally shifted the opposite direction to kind of counterbalance all of this. So we need to be really careful about not just saying, push your hip in or shove your hip to the other direction, because that is actually going to create more issues than it is going to solve, even if we think that it is going to make them look kind of more aligned or more symmetrical. In terms of working with these dancers, if we know we have a dancer who has a structural scoliosis, in an ideal world, every dancer would have access to scoliosis-specific care. So whether that is like Andrea introduced us to her clinic, the ScoliClinic, where they are dealing 100% with people with scoliosis and giving them individualized programs, that's honestly like the gold standard. But that is very, very much not the case for a lot of dancers. They're not necessarily going to have access to that. But as much as we can, having the dancers have access to like a physical therapist or even a like knowledgeable Pilates instructor, like somebody who's knowledgeable in scolio Pilates or gyrotonics or things like that, can make a world of difference for that dancer to understand their unique spine and their unique curves so that they learn how to work with it. A couple of sort of, key principles maybe is that we always want to think about elongation through the spine. So again, I was talking about, not asking the dancers to just shove their hip in or shift their weight to the side or things like that. We want to think about, okay, how do we create more space? How can we create more alignment using elongation, which thankfully is a principle we use in dance a lot anyway. So dancers are often very good at the elongation part of, sort of correcting some of their spinal asymmetry or their spinal alignment, and then using breath a lot as well. So using our breath, or the dancer using their breath, to be able to, fill space in the side of the curves that are getting compressed. And so creating, again, just this little bit of support for more symmetry in through the spine. Again, we're not expecting them to be able to keep that correction while they're dancing and 24 hours a day, but having them have the tools to be able to feel what those corrections feel like and being able to use those as a little bit of a reset when they're done class for the day, as a recovery strategy, maybe in class, in between exercises, in between, bar and center work, whatever it might be, or as part of their warm up so that they have tools and understand, how they can think about sort of correcting their spine or activating and elongating their spine in a way that supports their curvature so that they can kind of self-manage it a little bit. And then knowing that when they're dancing, we don't expect them to be 100% symmetrical. They are just not going to be 100% symmetrical. So I think my big sort of key message that I hope that people understand from this little add-on or part 2 of last week's episode is that although scoliosis sounds really kind of complex and scary and can be quite anxiety producing for a lot of people and a bit of an overwhelming diagnosis, it by no means that dancers cannot continue dancing and certainly can still achieve professional dance careers. And for teachers, I think if we can really understand the principles of scoliosis a little bit more so that we know how we can best support the dancers, and whether that just be reinforcing to the dancer that they are going to feel different from side to side, and their arabesque on one side is not going to look exactly the same as the other side, and maybe turning on one side is going to feel much, much freer and more balanced and more controlled, and on the other side it might not be, and that is okay, so that we as teachers aren't trying to constantly quote unquote fix them. And that's not to say we don't want to keep working on the sides that are maybe more difficult, but, helping the dancer to accept that this is the body that they're in and they can have a successful dance career, but it might just take a little bit more effort. Similarly to a dancer who's dancing in a hypermobile body, they have to put in more effort outside of the dance classes to make sure they're staying strong and controlling their joints and doing more self-care and recovery and things like that. A dancer dancing with scoliosis is going to be similar. So teachers, as much as we can, we want to support the dancers in doing that and make sure that they understand that that's going to be an important part of their dance journey, but it is by no means going to hold them back in their dance journey. So hopefully that was helpful, whether you are a dancer with scoliosis or you are a teacher and have dancers who have scoliosis or a parent with a dancer with scoliosis. I hope that gives you just a little bit more insight into the kind of dance specific side of scoliosis. Like I said,
The episode last week with Andrea was such a wealth of knowledge in terms of what scoliosis is and all of the science behind scoliosis. And then today I just wanted to tie in a little bit more of how it applies to dancers in the studio and dancers in their training. So I hope you found that helpful. If you have any questions or want clarification, please feel free to reach out to me. You can reach me on social media at Dance Physio Erika. If you're not already following me, follow me there, or send me an email. My email is in the show notes. Once again, thank you so much for listening, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.